And good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you to Social Work England for giving me the opportunity to talk to the workforce today, and also thank you to those who are attending. I know that we all have busy roles, and I'm really passionate about responding to child sexual abuse. So to see so many people who are giving that precious time to attend today, that's a great start for me in reassuring in how the kind of sector is also aligned to improving our responses to child sexual abuse. So thank you, everybody. So my background then, I am a social worker, so I'm a registered social worker, and I've been a social worker for around about 24 years now. 22 of those years I've worked directly with children, families in both voluntary and statutory sectors, responding to child sexual abuse across all of its forms. So I've not been with the centre that long. I joined the centre in October last year. But prior to that, I say my practice experience has been always with children, families impacted by child sexual abuse. Can you pop the slides on, please, Matthew? So for those of you who are familiar with the centre, that's fantastic. Welcome back if you've seen people from the centre talk before. And for those of you who are not, then please do give us a look up. There's loads and loads of free practice resources on the centre's website. And there's also lots of free webinars, free opportunities there again to think about practice responses to child sexual abuse. The centre was set up in around about 2017, and the focus was to help bring around system-wide change to responses to child sexual abuse across England and Wales. So we're funded by the Home Office primarily, although we do get some funding now from the Department for Further Education as well as the MOJ. And Bernardo's hosts the centre. Again, if you've not heard of us, look us up. There's a newsletter that you can sign up to, and that'll make sure that you keep up to date with all of the resources coming out that kind of highlight the centre's work. And if you can take us on, Matthew. So I know that Matthew has already alluded to this, but the topic is a tough one. I know that we're all working in roles that will bring us into contact with lots of tough areas of social work practice. But just that reminder that, we are only human. For some of us, I can see there's a very high number of people on the call today. For some of us, we will have lived experience of child sexual abuse. Some of us will process that. Some of us might not have acknowledged that yet. So please do look after yourself. If you need to take some time out to do that. And the other thing about the content is sometimes, certainly when I joined the centre, one of the things that struck me is I'd worked in the field of child sexual abuse for a long time. But some of the content that I'll deliver might cause us to reflect back on practice and practice opportunities where we missed opportunities to safeguard and intervene or identify child sexual abuse at the earliest opportunity. So if that should happen to you guys, that is absolutely normal, and I would expect that to happen. I would say that hindsight is a wonderful thing. We can't go back, but we can certainly take today's learning to improve future practice and learning. So just hold on to that as well. And next slide, please, Matthew. So before we get into the voices and experiences of children and young people, I'm going to talk to us a little bit about the scale and nature of child sexual abuse. I'll also touch on some of the impact of child sexual abuse and some of the obstacles that children and families face in talking and telling us, but also some of the obstacles we face as professionals working in this space to spot the signs and indicators, intervene and ask those questions. So my role in the centre and the work I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today, one of the first tasks that I was given was to work with higher education institutions across England and Wales, actually. Some of you might have picked up on my very sing-song Welsh Valleys accent, so I'm going to try not to put you to sleep with it. But one of the first tasks that I was given was to work with higher education institutions to support learning for social work students around child sexual abuse. So since October until now, I've been working with those institutions, working with social workers across all levels, so from those in training to those with kind of newly qualified experience, right through to kind of principal social workers and managers, to find out what is it that we need our social workers to know about child sexual abuse to be most effective in practice. And as part of that, I've also spoken to a number of children, young people and adult victims and survivors as well. So we're going to get to those points. But I'm going to start with thinking about some of the scale and nature of child sexual abuse and just how much of a problem is this for us as social work professionals. And you can see there that kind of the tip of the iceberg really is what we are working with as professionals. But the number of children who we estimate are experiencing child sexual abuse year in, year out is much, much higher. So across multi-agencies, across our professions, we're not at this point spotting and identifying all of those children who need a response to child sexual abuse. There's far more children who will be experiencing child sexual abuse today, and that figure is an estimate of children who've experienced child sexual abuse last year. It's similar figures for this year. And you can see kind of when we look at that 500,000 figure and we begin to see where support services come into play, 100,000, so about a fifth of those children will come to the attention of police. That's an England and Wales figure. So they'll come to the attention of police as victims of child sexual abuse. Some of that will be historic or non-recent reports of child sexual abuse, and some of that will be reports of children who are harming other children as well. And then when we look at the next figure, so this is an England only figure, we can see that around about half of those children go on to have an assessment that focuses directly on child sexual abuse, with kind of about a fifth again then going on to receive medical assessments and support to kind of make sure that their health is intact following child sexual abuse. And that's wider than forensic testing, wider than establishing whether there is evidence of child sexual abuse. That's a fuller medical assessment around kind of questions children might have around any harm that's happened to them. And that is such an important function for me to acknowledge, really. I've worked with so many children as teenagers who have talked to me about experiencing child sexual abuse in younger years, who still have questions about whether or not they have been permanently harmed, whether or not they can be a mum or a dad because of the sexual harm that they've experienced. So I can't advocate enough for our health colleagues at the point of us discovering child sexual abuse, that critical role they play in answering questions that if we don't support at that point and answer at that point, those children continue to hold those questions for kind of huge parts of their childhood. And then that really top of the iceberg figure is our children, and this is an overestimate figure, and that the actual figure is 2,160, but these are the children out of those 500,000 who go on to have support through child protection plans. So a much, much smaller number of children. And if you take the slide on, Matthew, and I know, I'm fresh out of practice. I know that not all children who are harmed by child sexual abuse will need a child protection plan. Lots will. My view would be certainly more than that figure that we're currently seeing will need that support, but others will be supported effectively in other parts of our social care system. So that could be through child in need plans, it might be through early help or family support. And for some children, that might be through parents who spot, support, intervene, give the right messaging, and those children don't need professional support at all. However, when we look at retrospective studies of children in need plans, and we ask adult victims and survivors to think about their experiences, we can see there on the bar graph that adults who report to this survey told us that they were experiencing child sexual abuse at the same rates as children who report in and adults who report in experiencing physical abuse, and not that significantly different to those who reported experiencing emotional abuse. But when we look at those adults who went on and told us actually we got support from professionals around this, we can see that physical abuse and emotional abuse tend to fare better in us providing recovery support than those adults who report in sexual abuse as a life experience. And then when we see the kind of graph on the side there, what we can see over a 30-year period, and this is the lowest figure in 30 years actually, and what we can see is that it kind of at the beginning of us starting to collate information around child sexual abuse and children placed on child in need, child protection plans for child sexual abuse, we can see actually we were at similar rates to things like neglect, and we were kind of higher than physical abuse at that point. But over those 30 years, we can see a decline. We see emotional abuse and neglect take a peak, but we see our sexual abuse kind of take a real nosedive. And what we know from practice is perhaps sexual abuse is one of the trickiest forms of harm that we find as a profession to talk about. And I think, having worked in the space for a long time, what I see is a lot of children being placed on plans for emotional abuse or neglect, because that's more palatable for us to acknowledge and talk about with children and families, rather than that thorny issue of child sexual abuse. And I think we also, as a profession, think that we have to be absolute certain for sexual abuse to name it. And I get all of those things, but what this means is when we don't name child sexual abuse on a child's plan, is our interventions and our support remain hidden and silenced and watered down for those children. So kind of learning, if I always think when I'm talking to people, if you can take 3 things away, then it'll be good learning opportunity. What I would ask is, if you suspect child sexual abuse, please, kind of name that in intervention and support plans for children alongside neglect, but make sure that features. Otherwise, we're at risk of continuing to keep this form of harm kind of secret and hidden, and kind of align ourselves more with those who are harming children and the children that we're trying to support. And then kind of a snapshot around sexual abuse again, and apologies, this is a very busy slide, everybody, so apologies for the assault on your eyes. I'm just going to pick out a few of the points here, and we can see, what this slide is telling us is, kind of sexual abuse is a very gendered behaviour, a gendered offence. So we can see actually that surveys and data tell us that more girls and young women will be sexually harmed than boys and young men. And I would urge again to remember that doesn't mean that boys and young men don't experience child sexual abuse, but they might not tell us about child sexual abuse at the same rate as girls and young women. And again, I think that can reflect on some of our responses and gendered responses to this particular form of harm. When I talk to professionals about sexual abuse, there is an assumption that it will be girls and young women who are harmed and boys and young men who are doing the harming. And our data kind of bears some of that out, but again, that caveat of this happens to all children of all genders, all ethnicities, all faiths. So we need to bear that in mind in our practice. And I'm going to look at that kind of age when the abuse started. I think that's a critical one for us and our profession to think about. So we can see there that kind of when we look at age of onset, age when abuse has started, and this is again asking adult victims and survivors to look back, reflect back, and tell us when they believe the harm began. Around about half, just over half actually tell us that it began before the age of 11. With around about nearly 70% saying that it began before pubescence, it began before teenage years. And then when we begin to think about longevity, what these group of adults are telling us is actually it continues throughout my childhood. So if you're those children who were 3, 4, 5 years old when it began, and that abuse continued for you for 5 or 6 years, that's happened for the majority of your childhood. And then kind of this is going to kind of feature when we begin to think about impact of child sexual abuse. And also, I think this slide and these points on this slide are really critical for us working with families where we're working with younger children who are pre-verbal or who have communication difficulties. So our early years settings, particularly where, if we rely on children to tell us about sexual abuse rather than as a profession getting better at spotting signs, indicators, and and kind of being curious around whether or not sexual abuse is kind of a feature or factor within our families, then we're probably going to miss a lot of these children until they reach that age where they're either brave enough to tell us or have the verbal skills to be able to tell us what's happening for them. We know from adult victims and survivors that that doesn't happen for the majority. You know, kind of most adult victims and survivors will talk about key points in their adult life where they found that voice and that courage to kind of speak up about their experiences. If we take us on to the next slide there, Matthew. And I guess kind of what I want to pull out on this slide is some similar themes from the previous slide, really, where as a profession, we really are likely to be already working with families where sexual abuse is happening for the children. You can see that figure there, that children living in homes where there is neglect are 5 times more likely to have experienced child sexual abuse than those who are living in homes where we're not identifying neglect. To me, that's a mind-blowing figure. And again, reflecting back on that kind of figure of we are including neglect in child protection plans, but not thinking about the sexual abuse. I think really, you know, kind of there's a real need for us to be more curious about families where we're working with neglect, and that can be neglect linked to kind of poverty and financial kind of difficulties, but also neglect around supervisory neglect, permissive boundaries or failure to protect. And so those families as well, kind of really key for us to keep our radar up around, you know, kind of, is there sexual abuse within this context as well? And we can see there that children who spend time in residential care are 4 times more likely to have experienced sexual abuse than those who only live in a family home. Now, what this figure doesn't tell us is whether or not that sexual abuse happens before the child comes into our care, or whether or not the child is harmed while in our care. From my practice experience, I would say that there's been a significant number of children where that's happened across both contexts for them. And then disabled children. So this is a particularly vulnerable group of children when we think about child sexual abuse. And we think about disabled children, and we think about, again, you know, their ability to verbally communicate with us. This is a group of children who might be less likely able to do that. We think about this group of children needing physical care, kind of intimate care as well. You know, a group of children who are going to have lots of adults providing physical care and intimate care, and that kind of opportunity for harm to happen to them increases significantly. And then we think about disabled children and maybe access to equitable information around healthy relationships. This is a group that in our education system we negate. We don't always give this group of children the same equitable information around what is healthy and what feels healthy in terms of relationships and sexual relationships, sometimes until that child is making mistakes in that context themselves. And then also for this group of children, we can explain away sexual behaviour as being part of a disability, or maybe we explain bruises away as, you know, the child being clumsy or falling, and that being aligned to part of a disability. So again, another real key learning point for me is this group of children, very vulnerable group of children that we will already be working with. And if we can take the next slide. And then we think about kind of our families and the kind of environments that we will be working within and the families that we will be supporting. We can see here that children who live in families where parents have difficulties around alcohol or drugs are 3 times more likely to be sexually abused than those without parental substance misuse difficulties. And then over half of the children who are sexually abused will be experiencing other forms of harm, so harm around emotional abuse or domestic abuse. And coming out of a specialist service into the Centre of Expertise, it was domestic abuse that was the most prevalent life experiences of the children that I was working with. And I think sometimes we can not fully appreciate the sexual harm that can sit alongside physical harm in the context of domestic abuse. So we might kind of see bruises, we might kind of recognise emotional impact, but we don't always consider the sexual harm that might be happening in adult relationships that children are exposed to. So kind of seeing kind of non-consensual sex, hearing rape of a parent by another parent or partner, and also hearing things like make-up sex within the context of domestic abuse. And for me, kind of that translated into behaviours for the children that I was working with, where perhaps they would use sex as a way to aggress because they had learned that sex can be used to control relationships and assert power in the relationships. And that would happen for very young children, you know, kind of 4, 5, 6-year-old children right through adolescence. And also they might see sex and sexual behaviour as a way to diffuse disagreements and appease difficulties. So they will see it as a way to stop shouting, stop arguing. And again, in school, you know, if there was a kind of raised voice by a teacher, we might see the child kind of reach out, touch, believing that that is the way to diffuse a disagreement or kind of, you know, a situation that's causing them anxiety. So that particular form of harm and kind of being aligned to sexual abuse for me is a critical thing for us to be aware of as social workers. And next slide, please, Matthew. So we're going to come to some of the challenges and obstacles now, and gosh, there are plenty. There are plenty for the children that we work with, but there are plenty for us as professionals as well. And none of us kind of mean not to see this or not to respond to this form of harm. But it is thorny, and there is something about us feeling like we have to be absolute certain that this happened, and we have to wait for children to tell us that this has happened before we can take action. Next slide, please, Matthew. So I really like this slide, and this is a kind of quote that was taken from one of my colleagues in the centre, and I just think this sums up things beautifully, really, that we as a profession, and not just social work, but across our multi-agency systems, place a lot of responsibility on children to tell us that they are being sexually abused. And again, think back to age of onset, that kind of age 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, that kind of expectation for children to recognise that what's happening to them is sexual abuse is way off, in my view, but then to kind of find that voice and tell us what is happening, particularly if they don't have that vocabulary or it's gone on for a long time and it's become quite normalised, then the chance that children are going to kind of rock up, sit by us and tell us becomes really kind of diminished. And for us as a profession, I think that we have to recognise that and take back the responsibility from the child to tell and place that back on us to notice. And I'm going to give you a really quick practice example of a young man, actually. And I worked with this young man. He was placed in a secure unit in the CSA Centre. And I was doing some research with boys and young men who were either victimised through child sexual exploitation or child sexual abuse. So I was working and talking to lots of boys and young men about their experiences of child sexual abuse. And this young man said to me, you know, look, I'm in the secure unit, and I was in class last week, and there was a teacher who I was acting up. I was kind of, you know, being a bit silly in class. It was actually an RSE lesson that was being taught. And he says, I was acting up, and the teacher says to me, I want you to stay behind. So he said, I expected to be, you know, kind of put into isolation or to be told off. But he said, the teacher got alongside me and he said, you're a really good kid. And I've noticed that there's been some changes in your behaviour, particularly in this lesson. What's that about? You know, what is that about? And he said, I was so taken aback that that teacher noticed that I told him, I said, well, actually, this has happened for me. And when you spoke about the healthy sexual stuff, that is what was going on for me. And I think that's just such a powerful message from children, that if we take the time to notice and then we take the time to ask, guess what? They matter. And when they matter, it matters, and they begin to tell us. And I think, again, you know, that is such an important lesson for us as professionals. And that child went on to say, you know, kind of at the end of the school day, Shah, the girls that are here, they get taken on a kind of one-to-one key working session. And that's great for them, you know, they get to kind of have their nails painted, they do some worksheets with their worker. But for us boys, we get taken en masse to the gym or the climbing wall or to play football. And I don't want my hair done, I don't want my nails done. But if I don't get an opportunity to talk to you on a one-to-one about the small stuff, about how my day was, about how I'm doing, I'm never telling you about the big stuff. And again, it's those kinds of messages as a profession we need to land and we need to listen to. Okay, if we take us on then, Matthew, and then we're going to think about kind of the similarities here actually in that obstacle of fear. Because what children say is, you know, I panicked, I didn't know what to do, I didn't know who to tell. And when I ask, you know, kind of my old team or kind of social workers that I've consulted with over the years, you know, kind of what were the barriers in it asking? It was panic, you know, and we were mirroring, the child was mirroring us, we were mirroring the child, we were all panicked about kind of, can we ask this? Are we allowed to ask this? And kind of look, the message really is that, you know, the national panel review that was kind of published a couple of years ago, or See Safe if you work in government, that's how that report will be referred to. Tells us quite clearly we can ask about sexual abuse. We don't have to panic. If we spot the signs, we notice, we can ask. We are not going to muddy evidence. We are not going to get this wrong. We are allowed to ask children if we are worried about child sexual abuse. So that again is a, you know, kind of key message for us as a profession, because very often when I think about my training and my early training around child sexual abuse, a lot of that came from the judiciary, who told me, don't ask, you're going to, you know, you're going to contaminate evidence, don't go down there, because, you know, we might not get that conviction. The truth is, for the majority of children that I've worked with, the harm that has happened to them has been by someone they love, they trust, and it's not always conviction that they want. They want the abuse to stop, they want the person that they tell to believe them, but they don't always tell me that they want the person who's hurting them to go to prison. In fact, that can be a huge barrier. And we have to accept that isn't always the outcome that the child wants. And if that's not the outcome, we can still support. We don't have to see that as the outcome. Our police colleagues, our judiciary, you know, that is an important outcome. And of course, if that's what the child wants, it is an important outcome. But it might not be what is the most important thing today. And we have to, you know, we have to carry that and hold that, and that's okay. And then kind of, I guess, when we think about some of the voices of children I spoke to, when I asked them, you know, what do you want to go into social work training? What do you want to go into the lesson plans for newly qualified social workers and social workers in training? For me, these are very easy things for us to do as a profession. These are things that, if I think about the reason I came into social work, these are all things I want to do. Yet, for whatever reason, children are saying, we're not getting this bit right, guys, so we have to really look at this. And for me, this is about relational social work. This is about working with children in a way that is relational and connecting and, you know, kind of building trust with them to get them to the point where they feel like, I trust this person to hold me. I trust this person to do the right thing for me. And some of the striking messages here for me is, you know, help me to see a better time ahead. So really, really important that this is a dark, awful, horrible topic for us to think about. But what children want is for us to say, but we've got you now and things can get better, you know, and I think that is the messaging that children want from us, that we are sorry this has happened, we believe you that this happened, but things can get better from this point. And then it is our role to make sure that we are either advocating for the right support for that child, or we are working in a way that conveys that they can talk to us and we can hold them through that. Next slide, Matthew. And then the impact of child sexual abuse, and look, we're all working in a field where we're working with people who, you know, have harms happen to them. And I guess, you know, sexual abuse impact, what I would say is we can assume that this is a form of harm that disrupts sexual development, and of course it does. When we think about child sexual development and a child who is sexualized at an age where they are, too young to know or understand what sexual behavior is, that is sexually disruptive. And we do need to kind of understand, how do we understand that? How do we work with that? How do we rebalance that learning for a child? But also we have to understand the social impact for children of sexual abuse and the emotional impact for children of sexual abuse, and also the cognitive impact as well. That child who can't sit and think and learn in school because they are worried about what's happening at home. That child who is making mistakes in attachments and relationships because they don't know what people want from them in terms of touch. So I want friends, I think that touching somebody might be the way to get it, but actually that has the absolute opposite effect. And it means that other children distance themselves, or it means that other parents say, don't sit by that child. The impact of sexual abuse for children is significant. And when we don't spot it, it is lifelong. And if we come across the next slide, Matthew. So again, I'm not going to kind of labour this too much, but I want us to think about that, kind of, while the impact of sexual abuse is unique for every child or adult victim survivor we work with, what we need to hold on to is the nature of the abuse. Kind of from research, what we learn is the nature of abuse can kind of be more or less impactful. And what I mean by that is that example of a child who witnesses maybe sexual abuse of a parent in the context of domestic abuse. That is still sexually abusive. That is not direct sexual abuse of the child, but it is still sexually abusive behaviour. When we think about children who are harmed online, now, that might not be direct sexual abuse, but it is no less impactful than contact sexual abuse. In fact, very often children will say it is perpetuating that image of me. I don't know where it is, who has seen it, when it's going to resurface. That is so perpetuating, that is lifelong, unless we can help that child to report, remove the image and rebalance some of that for them. And acknowledge that this is harmful. And equally as harmful as penetrative behaviours for children too. And the other thing that I'll pull out here is that sexual abuse, by somebody who the child knows, loves, trusts, can be kind of more impactful. It's that betrayal of a relationship. And I would pull out there and say that, when sexual abuse happens between siblings, we know that's no less impactful than sexual abuse that happens by an adult. So, when we think about impact, it's unique, but there are some things that will kind of be the same across kind of research, what research tells us around impact of child sexual abuse. If we take the next slide on, and then we get back to that responsibility for children, and we know that those who abuse children place responsibility on children for the abuse happening. So they will say, you enjoyed it, you got an erection, you got it, you enjoyed it, you ejaculated, you enjoyed it, there was vaginal wetness. These are things that we know abusers will say to children to make the child think that it is something about them and that they did enjoy it. And you know what? The amount of children I've sat alongside who say to me, but Shah, it did feel nice sometimes. How confusing for a child to think that actually people are saying this is abusive, but sometimes it felt pleasurable. How confusing for a child to unpick and understand that. And my response is, do you know what? It just makes you normal. That response that you had for, kind of an erection, ejaculation, a pleasurable feeling, that makes you very normal. So be reassured, first of all, you are normal. There's nothing wrong with you. There is nothing deviant about you. What it means is you responded in a really normal way to an abnormal touch. Our body and our emotions are programmed to respond to sexual touch in a certain way, and that's what it meant for you. It doesn't mean you enjoyed it. It doesn't mean it was your fault. It doesn't mean you wanted it. It doesn't mean that you're not harmed by it. It means that you were normal, and this is what we need to work on. So all of these things here are messages that might be given to children to put responsibility on them. And for me, these are key areas of our intervention as social workers. We need to work out, what was this child told? What does this child believe? How can I rebalance this so they can go on and have healthy sexual futures? And next slide, please. So then this leads us to kind of feelings of guilt and shame, that self-loathing. So, you know, those children that we say, you know, they have low esteem, they have poor body image. And for some children, they might even, you know, be showing kind of self-punishing behaviours, and that might actually be through taking control through them sexually harming as well. And, you know, we have to understand these as impacts of child sexual abuse, and of children being completely powerless in their abuse and believing that by needing to be in control and be powerful, they have to be the initiator of that sex, because that gives them a sense of, at least I'm in control of this. Really complex things, and, you know, complex things when we're working with adults who you know, display sexually abusive behaviours. But for children, this can feel really swampy and really overwhelming for us as a profession. But we need to know that these are the impacts and these are the areas that we need to be thinking about in our assessments and in our interventions for children. And next slide, Matthew. So what can help us then to identify and respond to child sexual abuse in practice? So I'm going to ask Matthew to take us straight to the video, if you don't mind, Matthew. I'm just conscious of time. And we're going to kind of introduce the video here, which is a Signs and Indicators video produced by the Centre. My director, Anna Galinsky, who's also a social worker, is going to kind of talk to us for 2 minutes about what's important for us in our social work practice when we're looking at spotting signs and indicators of sexual abuse.
Our Signs and Indicators template is designed to support a common language among professionals to identify, discuss, record and share concerns that a child is being or has been sexually abused. To intervene to protect children who may be being sexually abused, we need to build a picture of concerns. Not just the signs and indicators a child may be showing, but also the potential indicators of sexually abusive behaviour in those who may be abusing them. Additionally, some factors within the child's family or environment may increase opportunities for abuse to occur, and therefore also need to be considered. As professionals, it is our job to be alert to wider signs and indicators that something isn't right for a child, and explore all possibilities of what might be happening to them. We know there are many challenges to uncovering child sexual abuse. It simply isn't likely that a child will feel able to tell us directly what is happening. The responsibility is on us to gather signs and indicators of possible abuse, build a picture of our concerns and the child's experience, and work out what to do about them. In our Signs and Indicators of Child Sexual Abuse template, you can record and make notes of the signs and indicators of concern. As you work through each section, you will quickly be able to build a picture of your concerns, all in one document. Remember, a child who is being sexually abused may show no signs at all that they are being abused, or they may show many. Of course, the signs they do show could also be indicative of something else that is happening in their lives. Please remember, child sexual abuse can feel difficult and complex, but by all working together, we can tackle this. Do download the template and see how it could help in your role.
Lovely, thank you, Matthew. If you take that slide on. So I say Anna is my manager. I've worked with Anna for many, many years and kind of was involved as part of the reviewing team looking at pulling that kind of, I think, really useful guide together for us as professionals. And for me, I guess some of the key messages are, if we wait to see the signs of child sexual abuse in the behaviour of the child, then we're too late. If we are working with families where we are spotting abuser indicators or environmental indicators, then we equally have to be building a picture of concern around those. And for me, this template was one that I would use, if we take the next slide, Matthew, that I would use kind of in my supervisions, in my kind of chairing of strategy meetings, or in my kind of preparation to go into court, family court or criminal court, to build that picture of concern. And again, helping us to take responsibility away from the child, place it back with us as professionals, and present that kind of picture of concern, evidential threshold that, you know, we are worried about this child, and if it's not sexual abuse, then what is it? Because we were worried enough to begin thinking about these signs and indicators. What I would again stress is kind of when we're using the template, just be mindful of our own value base, our biases and any assumptions that we might have about particular kind of demographics and groups. So boys and young men, for example, we might think that a boy or young man might be behaving in an aggressive way because he's a boy, rather than because of sexual abuse. Again, when we're thinking about ethnicity, we might attribute adultification. We might kind of hear messages that children from Black or Asian heritage are more adult-like and assume more adult roles, including sexual roles. You know, we need to be aware of these messages and kind of biases around those, and make sure that we're not buying into that we are treating children equitably and we're thinking in the same way about all the children that we work with, and not allowing those kind of discriminatory messages to come into our practice. And if we take us to the next slide. So this is just a recap here, guys, about how I would be using this tool in practice, and about how social workers, you can embed and use the tool in practice as well. There are so many ways that I've used it, and you will get the slides afterwards to have a look at this. But for me, one of the most useful ways was working with a child who was maybe 14 or 15 and using the signs and indicators to track back along their chronology and look at missed opportunities for me to think, actually, this child is now working with me because of CSE or because of harmful sexual behaviour. But let me look at their life. Let me look at what's gone before. What did we miss? Were there things that we should have been doing 2, 3, 4 years ago that we didn't do? Because it's not too late. We can still ask that child about those life experiences. We can still ask the child how they understood those points of their life. And sometimes we don't always do that. We just work with what's in front of us without looking back at the chronologies. You can tell I'm a big fan of social work chronologies. Keep them up to date, guys. They are valuable. They are good. Next slide, please, Matthew. And then again, using that tool to record. For me, this is one of the best ways that we can take responsibility away from the child. If we record well, if we put down our thoughts and we use our professional judgment, we back that up. I would always save this signs and indicators tool into a child's file, because if my files were requested for court at that point, or 5 years or 10 years down the line, the judiciary could see my thoughts at that point on why I thought sexual abuse was happening. So again, making me responsible and accountable for that, not the child responsible and accountable for telling. And we will move on. I'm going to talk us through a case example. And again, this is to illustrate kind of what happens when we don't respond in a kind of proportionate, equitable way to child sexual abuse. So this is Lucy, and if you can get the rest of the slide up for me there, Matthew, that's great. So Lucy was referred into my old service, and the concerns that were referred in were around child sexual exploitation. On the referral form, these were the concerns that were outlined, and I guess us on the call can look at these concerns and think, yeah, actually that probably does represent some signs and indicators of child sexual exploitation. So we've got Lucy, who is going missing, sending naked images, involved in sexual behaviour, and there's frequently engaging in sexualised conversations and discussions. So our immediate thoughts of Lucy, and we're not kind of interactive. I'll give you some of my immediate thoughts when I got Lucy's referral was kind of, how old is Lucy? Who is Lucy living with? Where is Lucy going missing with? How long is Lucy going missing? What do we understand about the images that Lucy is sending? And then one more click, Matthew. Also, what does this mean for support of Lucy straight away? I agree that the referrer is as spotted signs of child sexual exploitation, but I still need to kind of better understand what's going on for Lucy, to understand what lies beneath those vulnerabilities to CSE. And if we take the next slide then, Matthew, because when we begin to ask those questions, what we find is that Lucy lives alone with mum. She lives in quite a small community. She's 15. So we've already got some things around age and stage of development and what does that mean? You know, we know Lucy is going to be more socially mobile maybe than a 5 or 6 year old. We know that the harm then is more likely to come from kind of outside the home, possibly still within the home. Where for younger children, you know, the harm is more likely to be solely in the home. So all of these things are, you know, kind of helping us to build an assessment and an understanding of what does Lucy need from us. We know that Lucy struggles socially. We know that she's undergone an assessment around neurodivergence. We know that she has some learning needs, and we know that her peers are particularly rejecting of her. We know that Lucy is aware of this. She knows that her peers reject her. She is desperate to fit in. She desperately wants friends, but her friends, her peers are kind of rejecting of Lucy. And there is some concerns around self-harming behaviour. And at that point, there's an assumption that the reason that Lucy is self-harming is because she is lonely and she wants friends but can't make friends. So again, in thinking about how does this help us understand Lucy, you know, we now have a child where we know there are additional vulnerabilities. So by age, by stage of development, we also know that there are vulnerabilities for Lucy around kind of disability, and we know that there are some social difficulties for her as well. So when we think about how does this help us understand child sexual exploitation, for me, I can see actually there are already some needs that are likely to kind of increase that vulnerability for Lucy. And if we take this to the next slide. So then when we do our home visit, we read our chronologies, we talk to Lucy, what we find is that Lucy was a child who was sexually abused by her half-brother when she was 10 years old. What we know is Lucy says that she believes the abuse began when she was around about 6. She doesn't really know for certain when it began, but she knows that her mum and dad separated when she was 6, and she remembers the abuse beginning when the family lived together. And she then remembers the abuse continuing until this point in her life, where she's now having contact with her stepbrother at dad's home. So for at least 4 years of Lucy's childhood, so between 6 and 10, we know that Lucy has experienced sexual abuse by her brother. We know her brother is 15. So then we also know that if that abuse began when Lucy was 6 and he is now 15, we are probably talking about a young child displaying harmful sexual behaviour. So that begins to kind of pique professional curiosity for me around what was going on in this home where we have sibling sexual abuse. Think back to domestic violence, think back to neglectful conditions. So I'm not just having to think about what does Lucy need to recover from in terms of child sexual abuse, but also those other harms that Lucy's likely to have experienced. We also know that her brother was incarcerated, so he was convicted and he was incarcerated. We know that as a result of that, her paternal family no longer speak to Lucy. They blame Lucy, they tell her that she's made this up. And while Mum believes that something has happened, Mum was told at the point of Lucy's disclosure when Lucy was 10 not to talk to Lucy, not to mention this to Lucy because it might result in muddying the waters and a conviction not being reached. So we know that from the age of 10 to 15, actually Lucy's not really had any family who've got alongside her, spoken to her about the sexual abuse that's happened. And in my discussions with Mum is saying, well, something happened, but I don't know if it's as bad as Lucy has said. And what we're talking about is, you know, kind of lots of incidents of penetrative sexual behaviour. We also know that Lucy wasn't offered any pre-trial therapy at this point because it was believed that that would again muddy the waters, mean that Lucy might not, the case might not progress through court. All of these things are totally inaccurate. We can offer Lucy pre-trial therapy. We can talk to Lucy about her experience. But these things were kind of instilled. And then we begin to think about what does this mean for Lucy and the concerns around child sexual exploitation. And again, this begins for me to think about, well, actually, Lucy is not only a child who needs to have recovery support around child sexual exploitation, Lucy's also a child who needs support to recover from child sexual abuse. And then if we bring the next slide up. So we get back to the concerns, the referral concerns, and what we see is that the concerns around Lucy going missing. Lucy was a child who was going missing in school. Lucy was going missing with younger children. Lucy was going missing with the children in year 7 and year 8. Lucy was in year 10, 11. She was going missing off the school site. She was going missing for parts of the day and for certain lessons. School were the people who were reporting the missing episodes. And the children that Lucy was going missing with were the children who were complaining to school that Lucy was sending them naked images of self. So Lucy is 15, she is sending those kind of 11, 12-year-olds naked images of self. It's also these children who are reporting that Lucy is talking to them about sexual behaviour, sexual discussions. And then there's some boys in Lucy's class. Lucy doesn't really get on with her peer female, so in class she is put to sit next to the boys. And the boys come forward and say to the teacher, actually, when you put Lucy to sit next to us, she tries to touch us. She's touching us over our clothing. She's also talking to us about sex. And what Lucy would say is, have you had sex? Do you want sex? Did you have sex with your brother? And again, how does this begin to help us understand Lucy's needs and the needs that Lucy's presenting with today? So if we take those slides on again, please, Matthew. And the next click as well. For me, what we've got for Lucy now is a child who, yes, the referral is correct. There are child sexual exploitation concerns, but there is also unresolved child sexual abuse that is likely influencing some of those child sexual exploitation concerns. And the next thing for me is we also have some harmful sexual behaviour by Lucy. And then I'm going to think about that gender and gender bias, because if we made Lucy Luke and we made Lucy a boy, I guarantee you the referral for Luke would have said, Luke is taking much younger children off the school site. He is talking to them about sexual conversation, engaging them in sexual conversations. He is sharing naked images with them. And he is touching other children without consent. Now, I'm not saying that, Lucy is getting the right or wrong response, although I think, what I would like for my boys and young men is that we better see the welfare concerns. For boys and young men, I am presented with the behavioural concerns first, and I have to go looking for the welfare needs. For girls and young women, I am presented with the welfare concerns first, and I have to go looking for the underlying motivations to some of those concerns. And I think what, I would say to my profession is, next slide, please, Matthew, is child first responses really matter, regardless of gender. If a child is displaying behaviours that sit outside a developmental norm, whether they're sexual or non-sexual, the first question that we should be asking is why? Why is this 6-year-old engaging in a behaviour that we would ordinarily see in a 15-year-old? Why is Lucy, as this age child, displaying these behaviours? We have to begin asking those questions. And child sexual abuse is a really tricky, thorny subject. And as a profession, I think we do a great job at responding to, single concerns. But my advice would be, look at the whole picture, because if we'd only looked at CSE for Lucy, we'd have missed CSA and we'd have missed HSB. And actually what Lucy needs for us is a holistic response to all of those needs, and so will our Lukes. And if you take us to the next slide, I'm going to end with a couple of quotes here from the children and young people. If you flip that on, please, Matthew, that I spoke to, who said, this is what we want you to know, Shah. This is what we want our social workers who are now training to be social workers to know when they come into practice. Again, no surprise, this is really relational. And this is also saying, work with our families, not just us. These are children who are saying, work with our carers. We were placed in care. Our carers weren't fully told about some of our aspects of our history. Sometimes we don't know that. But what they were saying is we were very dispensable then in the system. When we began to behave in ways that the carers weren't aware of, we were moved on. We were moved on very quickly. And so we hear more rejection and more harm for this group of children. And the next slide again, Matthew, and we're almost there. is around the importance of teaching all of our children around healthy relationships, what healthy relationships look like, feel like. That top quote there is such a powerful one for me, where we have a child who's saying, I had RSE lessons in school and that was the first time I knew that what had happened to me wasn't okay. I told my social worker, they were brilliant, they believed me, but they also said they'd spotted some signs and they hadn't asked, and that made me sad. And I think that is such, you know, these are children who are saying, ask us if you are concerned, please ask us. And then I'll just come to that very end green one in the bottom box there. And I don't know about you guys, but this sums up why I came into social work. But if I had the power, I wish that social services would listen to children more, for them to be there for children when they're needed, to respect the children's wishes and to protect them. That's the kind of social worker I want to be, and that's the kind of social worker I hope I am. So I'll kind of end us there.